Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual practices. In this episode, we'll talk with Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, author of the new book, Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. This interview was conducted before a live online audience and co-sponsored by Village Books and by the North Cascades Institute. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Katharine, it's such an honor to be with you. Thank you for taking time with us to discuss your new book.
Likewise, it's such a pleasure to be speaking with you. I only wish I could be there in person.
So help us to get a sense of your book. Why did you write this book at this time?
Well, I am not a big book writer, as anyone who follows me will know. I like to do videos. I like to do social media. I even just joined TikTok last week with my cat, Dr. Evil. Everybody has to be a doctor, right? But the reason I wrote this book is because I couldn't find anything else to answer the number one question that I am getting now every single day. And that question is, what gives you hope? So I figured as a climate scientist, I'm a good person to ask that question too, right? Because if a climate scientist can find hope in a world where every new scientific study seems more dire than the one before, every new headline tells of greater disasters than we thought were coming. Every next headline after that tells of how far we're falling short in meeting our climate targets and our climate commitments. I figured if I could find a source of hope, can't everyone? So I started looking myself because I can't keep on doing what I'm doing if I'm just overwhelmed with bad news all the time. And first of all, I looked to the science and I realized that as dire as the news is, there is hope, very clear hope in the science. There is hope because the science says that our future is literally in our hands. The choice is up to us. Some impacts are already here today, and some of those impacts are already bad, but they are just a fraction of what we can avoid if we act now. So hope is not the guarantee of a better future. It's the chance of a better future. And science says there is a chance. But where else does our hope come from? Often it comes from recognizing that we're not alone. So often I think we picture climate action as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on that boulder trying to push it up. And if we added our hand, it would do nothing, absolutely nothing. But if we start to look around and see who all is already acting on climate, we realize the giant boulder is already at the top of the hill and it's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. And it's already got millions of hands on it. And if we added our hand, it might go a little bit faster. And if we got everybody else at our place of work or our neighborhood or our school or our church or our city, if we got them to add their hands too, it could go a lot faster. And we could get it going down that hill. And so recognizing that we are not alone, that we really are together, that is a huge part of what gives us hope.
Katharine, so many books in the area of environmental advocacy today have titles like Save the Whales or Save the Trees, Save the Earth. You call your book Saving Us, though. And so I'm wondering, what is that about?
You're absolutely right. I don't know how many books there are with that type of a title, but a lot. When it all comes down to it, though, it is not about saving the planet itself. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. What is at risk is us living things on this planet. And of all living things after the polar bear, us humans, because we have built our entire civilization on the assumption that climate is relatively stable. We have 2/3 of our biggest cities within a few feet of sea level. We have parceled out all our water and our agricultural land to where now there isn't enough to go around. We are the ones who have built this vulnerability into our very system, and it is us who are most at risk. But unlike the polar bear, we have agency. We understand why it's happening. We are responsible for what's happening, but it's up to us to actually try to fix it.
Katharine, when I interview authors for the podcast, I often ask them what it is that they want to contribute to the larger conversation that's going on in the world about their particular topic. Your book definitely adds a lot to that conversation about Earth care that's ongoing. But one unique thing about your book is that it's actually addressing the conversation itself at a kind of a meta level. So I'm wondering, what is the message that you have for people about being part of the larger conversation on Earth care?
So after what gives you hope, then the next question I always get, what's the most important thing I can do? Tell me what is the most important way that I can put my hand on that boulder to get it rolling faster down the hill. And people often expect that I'm going to talk about light bulbs or recycling or diet or electric cars or public transportation or solar panels. And don't get me wrong, all of those things absolutely do help because they're cutting our personal carbon footprint, but they're also changing us. They're changing our investment. They're changing our perspective. They're changing what we can talk about with other people, which in turn can change what they're considering doing. In fact, in the book, I talk about how solar panels are literally contagious. The number one predictor of whether somebody has them is whether somebody else within a mile of their house has them too. So you see them every time you go past and you think, well, if they have it, maybe I could talk to them. I could see where they got them. I could probably afford it. We live in the same neighborhood. But even that is not the most important thing. The most important thing we can do is what most of us are not doing. 86% of us, according to a survey just last week, are not talking about climate change. And why does talking matter? Because it is about using our voices to advocate for change. And the only way the world has changed before, if we look back in history at the massive ways that our industrialized society has changed, it began not when CEOs or presidents or prime ministers or wealthy people decided that change had to come. It began when individual people did what they could, but the most effective thing was that they used their voices to advocate for the abolition of slavery, for women to get the vote, for the end to apartheid, or for civil rights. It was people using their voice that made that difference. So that's why I wrote the book, is to encourage people to do what we're not doing, which is using our voice, but not to dump a ton of science on people, but to start with something we share, connect the dots to how climate change is affecting it, and then talk about positive, real-world constructive solutions that they can get on board with. So if you don't mind, let's try that out now. Tell me something that you care about that's important to you that you might share with people who are listening in.
So a context to the answer that I'm going to give is the fact that I'm related to the governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee, and I'm proud of him. I love his environmental policies and support them. One plan that I am particularly fond of is his plan to electrify the ferry boat system in the state. Our ferry system is not just a tourist attraction. I mean, a lot of tourists use it, but all told in a given year, you'll have 25 million users that are both tourists and commuters. His goal over time is to convert ferries to hybrid and eventually electric, which would have a big impact, given that 73% of carbon emissions from transportation-related sources in Washington state come from the ferry system each year. And so to change that factor in the climate equation is actually going to have a huge impact.
That is unreal. So he's tackling something that's the biggest piece, the lowest hanging fruit, the biggest piece of the pie. And I mean, how many of you listening knew that that was the majority of the state's emissions?
So as crazy it might seem, there are actually people who oppose this policy, this proposed change to electrify the ferry system. Mostly, I think, because it comes from Jay Inslee and people see him as an environmentalist. And for some people, that's a bad thing. They equate the word environmentalist to liberal or tree hugger or nutcase, and they automatically close their ears to his ideas. And honestly, I find it particularly hard to talk to people who oppose the electric ferry project or who oppose other policies in the state that are meant for the long-term benefit of the environment.
Well, that's a good reminder that the same approach doesn't work with everyone. And sometimes we just aren't the right person to have that conversation. I mean, for some people, honestly, with your last name, they might be like, that might be it. The door might be closed. In my book, I talk about how I live in Texas. And I was talking to a group of farmers a couple of years ago, and I was explaining how what we're seeing today is not a natural cycle. It's a long-term trend. It's getting warmer, it's getting drier, and it's being caused by us. And at the end of it, one very honest farmer came up to me and he said, everything that you say made sense. And I would like to agree with you. But if I agree with you, I have to agree with Al Gore, and I could never do that. So he was very honest about the fact that his identity was so tied to his politics that he literally could not accept facts that his mind acknowledged were true because of where his heart was. So I learned from that. And in the book, I tell about how the next year I went to talk to a group of water managers. And I was speaking after 2 state elected representatives, both of whom overtly reject the reality of climate change. So they are on record as saying it's not real, it's not us, it's not bad. So elected official number 1, elected official number 2, and then here comes the climate scientist. So I decided I was going to conduct an experiment. I was going to talk all about the observed trends and the future projections and what that meant for water in Texas, for our reservoirs, for our irrigation, for our city water supply, for our long-term plans. But I was never going to mention the words climate and change together. So I gave this whole presentation without mentioning these 2 words together at all. But other than that, it was the same content and the same solutions and the same everything. And at the end, I will never forget, this woman came running up to me and she grabbed my hand and she pumped my hand and she said, "That was fantastic. I agree with everything you said. Those people who talk about global warming, I don't agree with them at all. But this makes sense." Because we had been able to talk about it in a way that did not sort of trigger whatever personal aversions people have to politics, to politicized terms. And we were able to figure out that, yeah, we actually agreed about, like she said, about everything, except what some people would call it. Because when it all comes down to it, what unites us is far more than what divides us. So what are some things in Washington State and in Northern Washington State in particular that you feel like most people would agree on that matter to them?
One of the creatures that lives in the Salish Sea off the coast of Washington State is the orca whale. I would say most people in the state like orcas. In those rare moments that we get to see them, it's kind of magical. Orcas are really a kind of iconic symbol for our region. And I can see how you could connect orcas with the electric ferry project, because electric ferries will be much quieter, relatively speaking. And the fact is that boat noise in the Puget Sound, interferes with the communication of orca whales and causes long-term stress. And electric ferries being really quiet will just be less disruptive. Another species that lives in the Salish Sea is salmon. People love salmon for lots of reasons. It's an iconic Pacific Northwest food, for example. Sports fishermen depend on healthy populations of salmon. So that might be another common point of discussion. Everyone loves salmon here, and salmon populations are declining. So that could help people to see maybe the sense of environmental protections that save salmon, because it could appeal to actually quite a broad sector of the population. Maybe the last point of shared interest with people in my region has to do with the mountains. Both residents and tourists appreciate the beauty of the Cascade Mountains and the Olympic Mountain Range. But honestly, in recent years, it's kind of hard to see them on some days. The view tends to be obstructed by smog much of the time. I suppose if we started our conversations with that shared problem, then electric ferries, which produce no pollution, might actually seem less threatening or a less triggering idea.
So the one that my mind immediately jumped to was that the water in streams is getting a lot warmer, which also affects salmon when they go up the stream to spawn. Sometimes it's so warm that they literally can't. And then also, of course, we know as the world gets warmer, wildfires are burning greater and greater area, and the wildfire season is starting earlier and it's ending later. And so, of course, that creates additional pollution that chokes the air, that people are breathing in, that you not only can't see the view, you literally can't take a clean breath of air outside. And I don't know how it was for you this summer, but I know I have friends who live just a little further east, and they were saying that their kids couldn't even go play outside for weeks on end because the smoke was so bad.
Yes, I've found that people's view on climate change has shifted as they've seen the impact it has on their kids. Dirty air changes from an environmental issue to a parenting issue. So when your kids can't go outside to play because the air is too hazardous, that really hits home.
It does. And it's interesting that you said that, because that's one of the perspectives I think that often holds us back, is that we think of this only as an environmental issue. So if somebody is already an environmentalist, if they're already that type of person, then of course they care. But if we only think of it as an environmental issue, which of course it is an environmental issue, but if we only think of it as that, then if we're not an environmentalist, we don't think of it as our issue. But as you just said, it is literally an issue. Like if you're a parent, it's an issue. If you care about your health or the health of your family or people in your community, it's a health issue. It is also a sport issue. It affects winter snow and recreation as well as sport fishing. It is a nature issue if you're a nature lover. It is an economic issue because it affects the economy and it affects the safety of your home. So whoever you are, and this is what I get into the book, and I go through lots of different examples, basically, whoever you are, you already have every reason you need to care about climate change. You don't need new reasons. You don't need new values. You don't need a new identity. You just have to figure out how what you already care about is already being affected by climate change. And it's a lot easier when we're having a conversation with an adult. With a child, you might be able to change their values if you're their parent and you work at it really hard, right? But once someone's an adult, you get the sense if someone wants to change your values, I'm not very receptive to that. I feel like I am who I am, and I've thought about who I am. And, I feel like I've made the choices I have because they're choices I feel are right choices. But if somebody says, yes, that's right, you're a good mother, you obviously care about your family, you care about science, you care about people. For me, being a Christian, and for you too, that's a big part of who I am. So if somebody sort of approached me and said, you're obviously a good scientist, a good mom, you care about the place where you live, you want to live out your faith. And so clearly because of that, you care about climate change because I'm also this or this, and I care about it because it affects as a Christian, the least of these. As a mom, it affects our kids. As a scientist, it affects this amazing world that we study. As a person who lives in this location, it affects our homes. And so then it makes me be like, oh, yes, so I am that type of person. Yes. And then climate action is it's a genuine expression of who we already are, rather than something that we feel like somebody's sort of trying to push on us because of their priority system, their value system, which is not ours.
We've been in conversation with Katharine Hayhoe, author of the book Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world. This is a book meant to empower and encourage people to recognize their opportunities for Earth advocacy in their everyday lives. This podcast, of course, shares that purpose. Our aim is to encourage and equip people like Julie to be Earth keepers and advocates for a greener living.
I just listened to podcast 34 with Alex Bailey, and he was so fun to listen to, and he got me so excited about what I can do in the world and how I can make changes in my life. I really enjoy the podcast that I come away from excited and challenged to be better than who I am and to see the world in a different way. I hope that all of the podcasts touch people the way they do with me.
If you find that this podcast helps you to be a better Earth keeper, we'd like to hear from you. Leave us a message via the voicemail link on the podcast webpage, or send us an email at earthkeepers@circlewood.online. That's earthkeepers@circlewood.online. And now, back to our conversation with Katharine Hayhoe. As people are listening to this conversation, many, I'm sure, have some specific people in mind, people that it feels impossible to talk to about environmental issues or climate change. Most of us have probably had those really hard conversations where no matter what we say, the other person gets triggered and can't seem to hear anything. And if we're honest, we get triggered too. We share responsibility when conversations lead to hurt feelings or broken relationships even. At least I can say that for myself. I'm wondering, are there certain kinds of people with whom we should be having conversations about Earth keeping? And conversely, are there some people that we simply need to avoid?
Yes to both questions. And I'm so glad you asked that question, because often when I say the most important thing we can do is to talk about it, people's minds jump immediately to the person they know who will not shut up about how it's a hoax. And we all have someone like that or more than one person like that in our lives. I do. Honestly, every other climate scientist I've talked to does, except for one. I know one climate scientist who doesn't have somebody like that in their lives. Usually it's a family member, or sometimes it's an old college roommate, or sometimes it's a next door neighbor. But we all have someone like that in our lives who is absolutely obsessed with the idea that this is a hoax, and they can't stop talking about it. They bring it up all the time, talking about how those climate scientists just made this thing up out of whole cloth, or they're always saying that the world is going to end and look, everything's just fine. And all those wildfires are just arson, that climate change has nothing to do with it. And if they would just rake those forests, that would fix the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And we just want to stick it to them. We just want to, I want debate point 1, 2, 3. And so they will just say, yes, you're right. You've always been right. I'm so sorry. I have very bad news. That's not going to happen. Why? Because those people, they're only a very small percent of the population. Believe it or not, according to the Yale program on climate communication, those people, dismissive people is what they call them, are 7% of the population. 7%. They're very loud, especially on social media. I meet them on Twitter all the time and Facebook. Only very once in a while on Instagram. People on Instagram are very nice. My personal definition for a dismissive is someone who would dismiss 200 years of physics, 2,000 scientists, 200,000 scientific studies, and literally if an angel from God appeared before them with brand new tablets of stone that said global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, they would dismiss that too. So why would I think they would listen to me? They won't. Because for somebody who's dismissive, climate denial is such a strong part of their identity that is almost like asking them to sort of metaphorically, but at this scale, remove a body part. Like that's how much it's part of them. But here's the good news. 93% of us are not dismissive. And in fact, people who are alarmed and concerned are 55%. 55% are alarmed or concerned. When you add in cautious, we're up to 75%. There's a small number that are disengaged, who've been living under a rock the last 20 years. I would like to find where that rock is. I wouldn't mind spending a bit of time there myself, just a week or two to get away from the world. And then there's 12% who are doubtful. They do have serious doubts. And then there's the 7% who are dismissive. But here's the thing. Even people who are alarmed, the majority of people who are alarmed, and this is not in my book, because the Yale program on climate communication, they didn't do the alarm study till after I wrote the book, but I asked them, I said, I have a bet. I said, I bet that most alarmed people are not talking about climate change and are not activated on climate change. And so they're like, oh, okay, we're going to look at that. So they did. And here's the result. They're not. Even alarmed people are not talking about it. In fact, we often self-silence because we assume that everybody around us thinks the same thing we do. Everybody around us is as depressed as we are. Nobody has anything good to say about it, so we just don't talk about it. So who can we talk to? Anybody in the 93%, but especially people who we share something with. So the best thing to do is, and try to do this now for yourself, make an inventory. So I'm going to do it myself first, then Forrest, I'm going to ask you to do it. And then everybody who's listening, I want you to do this inventory for yourself too, and to see what you might connect with people on. Okay, so first of all, I am a scientist. So obviously I can connect with people who like science. So this could be people at museums. This can be often kids love science. This can be fellow scientists. But I'm a lot more than just a scientist. I'm also a mom. So I can absolutely have conversations with other parents and grandparents. In fact, I co-founded an organization called Science Moms because I learned that 86% of mothers in this country are worried about climate change and have no idea what to do about it. So we co-founded Science Moms, and it's for any mom. And to be totally honest, we have quite a few dads and grandparents and aunts and uncles who have snuck in too. So, there's no check on who you are before you join. ScienceMoms.com to share information about what climate change is, why it matters, and what we can do to fix it. And you can follow us on social media too. So what else do I do? Well, I love winter sports. I'm Canadian. So I grew up cross-country skiing, downhill skiing, snowboarding, snowshoeing, winter camping, skating on the frozen ice. I love the winter. And of course, the warmer it gets, the shorter our winter season. We used to flood our backyard every year to skate on, and now you can't even do it where my parents live. The ski season is getting shorter. Where I live, we ski over in New Mexico a lot, and we didn't even have a season 2 years ago. So I can talk to other people who also enjoy skiing. And then, of course, I live in Texas, so I can talk to people who are from Texas about what's happening in Texas. And I'm a Christian. And so I talk to people about how the Bible says at the very beginning of the Bible that God gave humans responsibility over every living thing on this earth. I talk to people about how through the whole Bible, it talks about God's love and care for the most seemingly insignificant aspects of nature. I talk about how we Christians are supposed to be recognized by our love for others. And how loving is it when we close our eyes and our ears to the suffering that climate change is causing, and when instead we just point judgy fingers and are known more for our hate and our judgment than our love for others. So each of those different things, being a scientist, being a mom, living in Texas, being a Canadian, loving the winter, being a Christian, all of those things offer me a chance to connect with people over something that I share.
Somehow this doesn't seem quite fair. I suspect you've had lots more time to think about this.
That's why I went first.
Yes, well played. So I'm interested in many issues, and this podcast gives me opportunity to connect about a huge range of ideas. But I'm particularly interested in issues of community development, and I'm a professor of community development to the graduate level. My students are interested in working with people's needs worldwide, and especially have sights on working with the poor. There is an issue in community development as a field, though, and that is that sometimes the needs of people are overemphasized over the needs of the environment. So perhaps my interest in community development issues could actually lead to conversations with people who are developers, and maybe even lead them into conversations about climate change by talking about the ways that social justice issues are actually connected to environmental justice issues. Another area of interest for me and a big part of my life has to do with parenting. Because I've always been really involved in my daughter's activities, I've for many years interacted with other parents at school events like soccer games and assemblies and all of that. I know that my daughter's generation struggles with climate despair sometimes, and they don't have a lot of hope sometimes for the future. When I think about it, I'm really sure that other parents notice that about their kids as well. And the concern that we have for our kids could really be a profound starting place for a conversation with them about environmental issues. So there are a couple of points of common connection that I thought of.
Yeah, I like that last one. That one's so important. A new survey just came out surveying young people in 10 countries. And overwhelmingly, young people are not just alarmed about climate change, but panicked, depressed, overwhelmed. I mean, I see that among my own students. I teach undergraduate students. One of my colleagues had a student who was so panicked that if she just said the words climate change, the student would have a panic attack. That fear is rational. It is informed by an awareness of how truly bad this is. Again, it's not about the end of the planet. It's about us. It is about the future of civilization as we know it. It is about our lives, which we take for granted that we have electricity and water and a safe place to live and a thing called the economy. We take these things for granted. And these are the things that we will not have if we do not fix climate change. So that is definitely something that we can address, because who needs hope more than those who fully recognize how bad this is? And it reminds me of something that Greta Thunberg said, which she herself, of course, is still a very young person, though such a powerful voice. And she began by being very anxious about climate change. And so she convinced her family to stop flying, to change their diet, to reduce their carbon footprint, to do everything they could personally. And if she had stopped there, they would have certainly, made their personal changes, but they would have had no greater change in the world. She did one more extra thing, and this is why we know her. She took a piece of white cardboard and she just painted a few words, School Strike for Climate, and she went and she sat outside a building, which of course was the Swedish parliament. And because she used her voice to advocate for change, that is why we know her. And that is how she inspired millions of other young people and people in general around the world. And if she can use her voice, who else can use their voice? Can't we all use our voices? And sometimes we might be using our voices literally talking. Other times we might be using them through writing, through sharing. You use yours in your podcast. We might use ours in social media or making videos or as a teacher or as somebody who is active in our community or in our neighborhood organization or in our city or at our place of work. Or we can even use our voice in terms of where we bank, what credit cards we have, where our retirement is invested, because what's happening to that money? What's it being used for? There are so many different ways we can use our voice, and they're unique to each of us, but we're so powerful in that we can do that.
Let me ask a final question about your book. Your writing is very personal, very authentic. By telling stories of your successes and your failures at having good conversations, you inspire other people, I think, to believe that they can do it too. My questions then are, where did this courage come from? How did you come to be a person who uses her voice so effectively to speak up for the environment?
Well, again, it's not just the environment I'm speaking up for. I feel like I'm speaking up for all of us living things. Because in many ways, I feel like we climate scientists are like the physicians of the planet. So imagine if you were running a low-grade fever that went up and down from day to day, but it ticked steadily upwards week after week. And then you went in to see a physician and they ran a bunch of tests. And then they spoke to almost every other physician around the world. And they shared the test results. And they all concluded that you were suffering from an unprecedented, brand new condition known as global warming. And that the only thing to do was to stop burning fossil fuels as soon as possible, build resilience to the impacts that you could not avoid anymore, help nature help us. Nature would like to soak up some of the carbon we've produced if we can restore and invest in ecosystems. And all the doctors in the world agreed, but you didn't want to listen. And then it turned out everybody in the world had this fever, including the doctors themselves, but nobody wanted to listen. That's the situation that we're in today. And so as someone who knows how serious it is, and you don't have to be a scientist today anymore to know how serious it is, all you have to do is look outside your window during wildfire season. It's really up to all of us to share that, because what's at risk again is not our great-great-grandchildren. It is not people who live over on the other side of the world. It is not only the non-human living species, although they are certainly at risk too. It is us here and now today. And so I definitely get discouraged. I definitely get frustrated. I have stories in the book of conversations that went horribly wrong. And they're sort of unintentionally humorous often. And I feel like I learned the most from them in retrospect, but they didn't feel good when they were going on. I can tell you that. But I keep on going because it is the truth. And because of what's at stake, it's my son's future that's at stake. And, as a mom, I would do anything for him. And today, anything means fighting for a fix to climate change.
We've been in conversation with Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. For more information about her work and her new book, check out the many helpful links you'll find on the Earth Keepers podcast website at www.circlewood.online/earthkeepers. That's circlewood.online/earthkeepers. Earthkeepers podcast explores ways in which we can change ourselves, our communities, and our cultures to help us to care for the earth in holistic and regenerative ways. Through curated conversations, we highlight the wisdom of thought leaders and change agents who are making a difference and showing us a way forward. When Earthkeepers stand together, they amplify the impact of their resistance against environmental injustice and multiply their efforts for renewal and restoration. I am Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Olfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jessalyn Megerly is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us next time on the Earthkeepers podcast.